Hi, the poem I'm going to be taking you through today is A Wife in London by Thomas Hardy. This is another one of the war poems in our anthology, but could come up as a question about love, so you would need to be prepared for both aspects of the poem should you meet it in an exam. As before, I've tried to give you some images to jog your memory, to perhaps give you some context and something to relate to. These images are duplicated on the blog, and as is a copy of the poem. If you've already met this poem, if this is revision from you and you've done this poem before, pause this video now at this point and answer the 3 questions. And then you can play the video again to check your answer. This will really help secure the knowledge in your long-term memory. It's a really good revision technique and one you should practice all the time. Okay, let's get going. Thomas Hardy is the most anti-war of all the poets that we meet in our anthology. Unlike Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, Hardy is a pacifist. He is completely and utterly opposed to war. This poem that he writes is just one of a selection that he wrote during the Boer War, which was happening from around 1899 to the early 1900s, 1903 in South Africa. At the time the poem was written, there weren't the communication benefits that we have now of mobile phones and the internet, and communication with families was incredibly poor. People didn't know really where their loved ones were serving, and didn't really know what was going on. There was no minute-by-minute news as we have now with battlefields around the world. Interestingly, Hardy is one of the poets who begins to break with tradition at this time. From writing about war as some sort of glorious adventure, Hardy really shows the horrific impacts of war on society. He writes a lot about death and the effect of the war on individual people. Hardy in this poem seems to suggest that the wife doesn't even know where her husband is fighting, and that creates this idea that people were dying for a cause which they didn't even understand. They were dying without even really knowing why. Okay, let's get started in the way that we usually do with the poem. She sits in tawny vapour that the Thameside lanes have uprolled, behind whose webby fold on fold like a waning taper the street lamp glimmers cold. A messenger's knock cracks smartly, flashed news is in her hand, of meaning it dazes to understand, though shaped so shortly. He has fallen in the far south land. 'Tis the morrow. The fog hangs thicker, the postman nears and goes. A letter is brought, whose lines disclose by the firelight flicker his hand whom the worm now knows. Fresh, firm, penned in the highest feather, page full of his hoped return, and of the summer-planned jaunts of break and burn in the summer weather, and of a new love they would learn. Okay, so the first language point that I would draw your attention to is the fact that the wife is stuck. We've got language which shows she's both confused and that her life force, her will to live, the thing that keeps her going, is fading. So, for example, she sits. It's in the present tense. Not she sat, but she sits, suggesting that this is an ongoing process and that all she does on a day-by-day basis is sit. That's very static. It shows a lack of activity from the wife. She's very passive. The world is affecting her, and she can no longer do anything about it. We've got this idea that the fog is webby, sticking her in place like a spider's web, and the waning taper, a candle, is waning, going out. I don't think that she's dying, but certainly her will to live has faded, and it might also represent the fact that her husband has died. And then in stanza 2 we see that she's dazed. She can't really take in this news. She can't process the information. So language point 1, language showing confusion and the fact that the wife is stuck. Her life doesn't move forward. I showed you this clip here, using it on this slide, this idea of these scenes in her life running through like an old-fashioned film reel, and here the projector's stuck. She doesn't move forward and she can't really see a way to get it going again. So, language point 1. Language point 2, I would write about the pathetic fallacy, the use of the weather to reflect the wife's mood. Here we've got tawny vapour, this idea of fog, and the next day the fog hangs thicker. This comparative here, thicker, showing that it's getting worse. Her life isn't improving. Things are going downhill for this woman. With the death of her husband, she really can't see a way forward, and that's getting worse on a day by day. And when we combine that with the idea of this lack of light, this inability to see a way forward, we can see that the street lamp glimmers cold. We've already discussed the waning taper, but the firelight's only flickering. Again, this inability to see a way forward. So I would draw attention to the use of pathetic fallacy and the lack of light, showing that the woman's situation is getting worse and she can't even see a way forward. Language point 3. I think the graphic language here, the idea that the only thing that knows him now is the worms that are consuming his dead body. That's very, very graphic. This is not war as glorious. Written, of course, before Rupert Brooke wrote his poem The Soldier, but taking a very different stance, where Brooke says, if I should die, here we've got a definite death, and we've got this awful image of the worms eating the dead husband's body. And it's made more tragic when we contrast it with this idea that he hopes to return. And when we look at the sequence here, we know that of his death before we know of his hoped return in the final lines of the poem. And that's what creates the tragedy in this poem, the horror in this poem. This young soldier was hoping to come back to his wife, and yet he's died. You know, he's died in South Africa. And the contrast here with this graphic imagery of him being consumed by worms, just horrible, really, I think. Very, very sad. Looking at the structure now of the poem, and you need a couple of structural points, and obviously we've got these subheadings in this poem. They stand out, the tragedy and the irony, but they're also numbered, look, 1 and 2 here. It's divided into 2 sections, like a play is divided into 2 sections, or like 2 key scenes on a roll of film from her life. But these 2 scenes, even though they take place over consecutive days, they're the most monumental scenes in her life. They have such long-lasting effect on her. The impact is really, really significant. So even though we only see 2 snippets of this woman's life, we see the 2 most important scenes of her life. This telegram saying her husband's dead, followed by the tragic arrival of this letter saying that he can't wait to return. So while it's divided just into 2 scenes, you will say to the examiner that they're the most significant scenes in her life. And then the other structural point I think you should draw attention to is some of the punctuation. Now Hardy uses dashes here and ellipsis markers. And the dashes sort of show her confusion. She's struggling to get the thoughts together. She can't make a coherent sentence or even think a coherent thought. He has fallen in the far south land. And the ellipsis markers here I think are particularly interesting because it's an unfinished thought. Ellipsis markers show missing information. And here the missing information is, where on earth is this far south land? The suggestion is she doesn't even really know where he's died. She'll certainly never have an opportunity to visit his grave. So it's as if there's no closure, and the ellipsis marker mark these out as an unfinished story. Number 1, she doesn't have the finished information, but number 2, she won't really get closure from this, not even knowing where he's died, and certainly never being able to visit South Africa to visit his grave. Okay, Hardy shows us in this poem that war has effects on people who are not even soldiers. It's very easy for us to think about war as and the impact it has on the men who die and who fight and die and are injured. But here Hardy shows us that the effects of war sort of ripple outwards, affecting here a wife, and we can assume affecting mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and friends and children. You know, Hardy's showing us here that war is futile. The impact is not just one dead soldier, but it's a ruined life for this young woman as well. He uses the case of a wife, to show the stupidity and futility of war, and he particularly chooses a wife, not the wife. So to represent any of these young women whose husbands were fighting and dying for their country in foreign countries, the reader must obviously feel some sympathy for the wife. Her life's stuck. It's on hold since the death of her husband, and she can't move forward. And we don't know what becomes of her, but we're left to imagine that her life is not great from this point on. This poem links really well with Mamet's Wood, as both show the wider reaching impact of war. In Mamet's, the war is affecting Owen Shears and the farmers who uncover the grave. Here it's affecting a wife, thousands of miles away from the battlefield. But it would also link to the manhunt, which both poems show the impact of war on soldiers' families, particularly both wives. And the manhunt is the poem I'll be looking at in the next video. I hope this has been useful. Thanks for watching.